Thanks, Rick. Well, I suppose entrepreneurship to me isn't only about business and isn't only about making money. You can be an entrepreneur in any walk of life, in anything you do, whether that's social enterprise, even enterprising doctors. I met an enterprising doctor yesterday in cancer research, and his whole being was about being enterprising because he needed to raise money for research, and so he was very keen to explore angles that he could do that. For me, my own story started when I was obviously as a very young child. My mother and father had a very a difficult and often violent relationship. Although they were never violent to me, I love both my parents a great deal, and I only say that now because as I go through this story, a national newspaper reporter once asked me if I'd been abused, and I hadn't ever been abused. My parents tried to look after me, they just weren't very well equipped to do so. That's a slightly different angle than someone deliberately doing something. So my mother taught me to read from a very young age. My hyperactivity, which was just there. I just was a continual problem in escaping from the garden on the council estate where we lived. And my mum and dad both worked full time, so I was often left with different people. And then when I was, first time I ever ran away from home, and I'm always I did a speech just recently to the Children's Society, and I said, don't ever do this. I was 2.5, and my son's in the audience today, and I disappeared for 24 hours at 2.5. And they found me in a bush on Horfield Common in Bristol, asleep, the following morning. And I basically just got out the gate. And I developed this sort of, this went on, and I was frequently doing this. And when I got to, the police picked me up and they took me back home, and that was that. I was there for a while, and then I'd disappear again, and this sort of went on until the age when I was 7, and I was telling this story to someone just recently. I developed this sort of fantastic way of traveling around the countryside as a young kid, and it was I used to hang about by the bus stop or by the train and wait for families, and I'd wait for 2 or 3 families, and then their kids would be there, and I'd mingle in with the kids. And this family would think I was with them, and that family think I was with them, and I'd just get on the bus or get on the train, and I ended up in London when I was 7. It's true. And I got off the train and somehow managed to find my way to Buckingham Palace. And I was hanging about, just hanging about with different people. And then this policeman sort of noticed me there. And he said, he thought I was with a family, and I said, well, he said, sort of spoke to me, and I said, well, I've sort of come to see the Queen. Is she in? And he said, yeah, and sort of humoured me. And then about 7 or 8 hours later, he noticed that I was still there, hanging about. And a call went back out to Bristol. This kid had been, and they found that I'd disappeared 18 hours. I hadn't run away. I just have to say this. I wasn't running away from home. I was just investigating. And I recently was fortunate to have lunch with the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh. And I said to Prince Philip about this, and I said, well, the only reason I recognised the Queen is because I'd seen her on the stamps, and when she came in, and he was okay with it. And for me, it was just that. And I had gone to London not to run away from home. I'd gone to London because I was desperate to have a dog. And I was never going to get a dog, I didn't think, and I was desperate to have one, and I used to read everything that came up. My mother taught me to read from a very young age, which was fortunate for me because I never went to school, and if I hadn't been able to access the libraries, which probably eventually led to me being entrepreneur in residence and ambassador at the British Library, I probably would be doing something very different today than what I do now. And because she taught me to read, and she taught me to read reasonably quickly. And the reason she did that was because she used to read romantic fiction, not serious stuff, just romantic fiction, my mum. But she taught me to do it because she was worried I wouldn't be focused long enough to read anything if I didn't do it quickly. So she taught me to read quickly so I didn't lose interest in what I was doing. So I read the Observer Book of Dogs, and I decided that, well, the Queen had these corgis, So I'd go up and ask her what she thought about corgis. And that was the reason I got on the train, and that's the reason I went to London. So that was the sort of the way life developed for me. When my mum disappeared at 4, she had a breakdown. And suddenly at 4 years old, my dad was 51 when I was born. He'd come out of the army in the war, had no idea whatsoever what to do with a hyperactive 4-year-old kid. And my mum had just disappeared because she had this breakdown. For 18 months, I lived with my dad. And in those days, in a council house, if you lived in a council house, and I'm sure people here will relate to this, some people anyway, you couldn't live in this council house had 3 bedrooms. So you weren't allowed to stay in a 3-bed house unless you took all the bedroom space. So a man in those days with a young boy, they wouldn't be very keen. My dad was paranoid about the fact, because I was the only thing he had really, of losing me to the social services, or whatever they were called then. And so we came up with this plan, and I always think it was my first business deal, because we came up with this plan, or my dad came up with the plan, and me as a young little kid must have gone along with it somehow or other. And I basically remained in the house from 7:30 in the morning, locked in, until 6:30 in the evening, 11 hours, every day, for near enough 18 months. So during that time, what did I do to occupy myself? Well, I read, because my mum hadn't taken all her books. So I was probably one of the only kids that ever read Lady Chatterley's Lover, age 7. But it was a great read, actually. But so that was life for me. And my dad was never unkind to me or anything. We had a great relationship. He wasn't doing that. He was doing it to protect me, but it was misguided. Anyway, nonetheless, this sort of went on. So my early life was about that. And because the education authorities, my mother had gone off and she ended up living in a place called Malmesbury. She recovered. She met another guy. Eventually, she married him and they lived together for the rest of their life. But at that stage, when I was 5, coming up to 5, about 5 and a half, they lived in a 5-berth caravan by the River Avon in Malmesbury in Wiltshire. So I went to live with them because the courts eventually gave my mother care and control, custody, and my dad care and control. Bizarre. My dad still lived in Bristol in a council house, and I lived then with my mum in this caravan with her new husband in Malmesbury. And that's how life sort of went on, you know. So because in those days, the education authorities didn't really integrate like they do today. You've got to bear in mind. I mean, my family, it wasn't until, well, at no time until the incidents when I started in business did I ever use a telephone. So we never had a telephone, we never had a car, we never had a fridge, and at some point we acquired a carpet in the living room. But, you know, those were the sort of things that happened. And so we didn't have access. I didn't have access to any of those things, but I had access to books. And this is the big thing. I was a great reader. I was a great believer in anything I wanted to learn. I could find the answer in a book. Today you might find it on Google, I suppose, but in those days I found it in a book. So that was sort of my early life revolved around between those two areas. Well, Wiltshire Educational Authority didn't really liaise like you would today, educational authorities. Bristol, it was a different thing. It was as if it was, I mean, never believe it today. I mean, you've got to bear in mind, in those days, a long-distance call would have been a call between Cardiff and Newport. I mean, it was, you know, that was considered a long-distance STD call. So it just goes to show you at that stage how difficult it was. And often young people say to me today, it was much easier when you started. You know, it would have been a lot easier. Well, I can tell you it wasn't. There was no such thing of going to the bank with no deposits. This new thing about deposits to raise money, raising money was a non-starter for someone like me. I didn't know anyone with any assets against which you could borrow money for a start, and I definitely had no idea how you went about it. Simon Jack, a while ago on Radio 4 on the Today programme, said to me, well, you know, if you find a rich banker, and because the idea was that I'd met this rich banker who gave me all this information. Well, the rich banker, I can tell you, when I started Easy Clean, was a guy that I used to do his garden for. He was a Lloyds Bank manager who was a manager in Westbury-on-Trim for Lloyds Bank. He was a local bank manager. He wasn't someone from the city with an investment portfolio. This was just an ordinary guy. And he was good enough to teach me finances because I needed to know. Because I'd gone along by then. I started to develop my business. I was 15 or 16, and I couldn't have a bank account, but I had a trustee savings account. And it wasn't until they told me that I couldn't put any more money in it, because it was £30,000 limit, that I had to go and then open a bank account. So I didn't know how to do that. So I went to the only guy I knew who was a bank manager at Lloyd's Bank, as I've just said, and he said, you do my garden. So I did his garden for nothing, and he taught me about finances. It was an exchange. So as I sort of came up to 10 and 11, I still lived partly between my mum and my dad. I never went to school. My mum and dad never spoke, only once in the rest of their lives. So their liaison was me. I was the negotiator. Age 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right through my childhood, I was the negotiator between my mother and father. If my mum wanted to say something to my dad, she did it through me, and the other way around. So I learned to negotiate, I suppose, partly by doing that. And but what I did was realize I didn't go to school. As many times since I wished I had, but I didn't. And I avoided the education system almost entirely, which is why I'm so keen on education today. And my son's in the audience tonight, and he will tell you I rabbit on about getting a good education everywhere I go. So I'm not an advocate of avoiding education. What I did was educated myself by reading certain books. So if I wanted to know about something, and my interests weren't only business, they were anything ranging from butterflies to deserts. And I would get a book on that subject and read up on that. And it wasn't until a friend of mine took the 11 plus and passed that I realized that I was missing out on some sort of education, because I was just a kid and I'd never been to school. And he had, and he's now going to a grammar school. And I thought, well, I better do that. So I asked him what questions they'd asked him in the 11 plus, and asked him if he could write them out. And then I tested myself on the 11 plus questions that he had answered. Never surprised, I actually passed. So, my own test. So that was the way my life sort of started. And because we didn't have my father didn't understand business. He was a French polisher. He always worked, but he never had any money. So he didn't understand business. And I was sort of always interested. So when I was around this is a sort of a tip of perseverance, really, because most businesses in the early stages fail. And they fail through two things, in my opinion, today. And that isn't just lack of money, funnily enough, it's lack of knowledge. I'm absolutely stunned sometimes when people come to me at the British Library and they present a case for something they're doing, and the lack of knowledge is huge. They just haven't really swatted up on the structure of what they're doing. And that's what I think they need to do. So it was about knowledge. And when I was 11, coming up to 12, I wanted to get a paper round. And you think, well, you just go and get a paper round. Well, for me, it wasn't like that, because I would spend 2 weeks in Malmesbury and a week in Bristol, and then I'd go back, and all the time I'd be telling each parent that this is what I had to do, and they sort of, for their convenience, I suppose, often went along with it. So I couldn't get a paper round like a normal kid would get. So I developed this method of making more money at a paper round than all the other paper boys. And the method was this. I would go to the newsagent, and I suppose this is sort of a beginning of an entrepreneurial life. I'd go to the paper shop early, 5:30, 20 to 6 in the morning, particularly in the winter, particularly if it was raining. And then I'd say to the guy that used to put the papers up, in Malmesbury, it was a guy called Peter Sevin, it was W.H. Smith, and I still know him to this day. He's in his 70s now. And he was then in his 20s, and I was 12, and you were supposed to be 13. And I'd go and I'd say, how many paper boys have you got that haven't turned up? And he'd say, 3. And I'd say, I'll do a round. And he'd say, which one? I say, all 3. And he'd say, great, can you do them? Because I wasn't worried about getting to school early, you see. So I could take my time a bit. So he'd say, okay, you'll do all 3. I'd say, how much do you pay? And he'd say, 5 bob or whatever it was. And I'd say, it's double. And he'd say, no, 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 there's a standard rate for paper boys. I used to say, no, there's a standard rate for paper boys that come at 6 in the sun. I come at 20 to 6 in the rain. And you've got 3 rounds and nobody to do them. So if you want to hire me to do those rounds, it's double. And he would tell the story to this day. He's a yoga teacher now. And he said, you know, you taught everyone the art of laid back in those days because you used to, because I used to walk away. And I'd say, no, 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 those are my terms. It's double. And the times he chased me down Malmesbury High Street and said, come back, come back, come back, I'll do it. And then he would say, and he would tell you the same story, okay, when you've done the rounds, it's double. I said, no, 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 in advance. And he'd say, no, 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 we don't pay in advance, we pay at the end of the week. I said, only when it's sunny and the people turn up at 6. It's 20 to 6 and it's raining. Pay me double in advance, because I'm not going to do the round, and then I come back and you say, well, actually, I've thought about it, and I will pay you the rate, but not your rate. No, no, you pay me double. I've got possession of the money. I will now carry out what I said I would do. And that's another tip for businesses that I often say to young and old people that go into business. And I've got a friend of mine in the audience tonight, Rob, and he will tell you, I always harp on about this, you've got to do what it says on the tin. If you say you're going to do it, that's a contract. Yes, you might want to get it in writing. Yes, you should get it in writing because there are unscrupulous people about. But for me, if I say I'm going to do it, I'll do it. That's it. There's no messing about. If you promise, if you say, that's it. And in my life, I tried to keep to that always. And that's a key, and that's what I used to. But I am aware that not everyone lives on those principles. So it is important to get contracts signed up. Later on in life, when I was exporting to France and Russia and the States and all over, but when I'm we're ever exporting today, anything to a country where the language is not first language isn't English, I insist on the contract being in English. And the reason, and drawn up by my lawyers, so that any nuances in the language are in my favor, not in my customer's favor or in my supplier's favor. And if they won't agree to it, we won't do the business. We just won't. And it isn't because we want to renege, it's to make sure anyone else can't. And any nuances in the contract law are in our favor. So I learned that early contract negotiation because unfortunately the world is full of, well, not full. Most people are honourable, but there are people that aren't. And you have to guard against that, unfortunately. So I went on from there, and then I developed this plan because of doing the paper round. I developed this plan of, I was in W.H. Smith's one day where I used to do some of these paper rounds. And I saw this colouring book. And this is another sort of lesson, really, for anyone, I think, going in, is to always keep your eyes open about everything. Recently, I was in Siberia, and in the middle of nowhere, and I noticed all these people with this particular boot, walking about with this particular boot. And now, I thought, well, that might be good for ski wear, or maybe for mountain wear, because a friend of mine was a mountaineer. And so now we're negotiating with the manufacturers of this boot to export, to take them from them and export them all over the world. And it came from sitting in a coffee shop, freezing, watching these people walk about with these boots. But this time in W.H. Smith's was really the catalyst for that, because I noticed a colouring in book. And this colouring in book was two shillings. And the way it used to be written. And I can see it now on the corner of the book. And it was just simply paint by numbers, or colour in by numbers. And it had 49 pictures of perhaps an audience like you guys, and a horse, I'm sure there wasn't an audience actually, but a horse and a cow and a dog and something else, and houses and all sorts. And it was paint by numbers. So it was really, I thought, well, that's easy to do, but you just colour in and then you get this wonderful painting or this wonderful drawing, coloured in drawing. Problem was I wasn't very good at it. So I took it, and my idea was to colour it in and then take it and cut the pages out after I'd done it and put them into a frame and sell them door to door. And that was my idea. I'd go around all the posh estates and flog these pictures, because it was really cheap, because I had 49 pictures for 2 bob. See? So if I could get 10 bob a picture or 5 bob, I was in quids in. So I thought this was great, but I was actually rubbish at drawing. I just couldn't get this, wasn't fast enough for me. I wanted to colour it in quickly. So I thought, well, there are a couple of girls that were, my age, so they were brilliant at colouring in. So I seconded them into it, and they used to do the colouring in of these quickly and cut the pages and put them in the frames, and then I'd take them. And by then, I'd acquired a W.H. Smith used to give you. We were with the chief executive of W.H. Smith, and they used to give us these paper bikes. They had no gears, and they were great iron things, great with pannier bags, but it was great for me. It was like a company bike, because I didn't have a bike, and I wanted this bike to do other paper rounds for other news agents as well, But so I had these things, and so I used to take these pictures in these pannier bags, and I'd go around all the posh houses flogging these pictures, which stood me in it very little. And I sold for quite a lot. So I had a little factory going with 2 or 3 friends. They were girls because they were brilliant at drawing, these girls. And I'd go and sell the paintings. And that was sort of a management exercise I learned there about gearing up, about the fact that by leading an enterprise, everyone can gain. Because the drawings were done beautifully. Admittedly, it was paint by numbers, and I'm sure the people that actually bought the paintings didn't realize we were actually coloring in 1 to 12 in these colors. Number 1 was rustic brown, number 7 was green, and if you did it all, you ended up with this great horse. Except for if I did it, the horse was green mostly. But they were really good at it, and so that's what we did. And I'd go and sell these paintings, and that was enterprise because I produced money for me, I produced money for them. I even used to give my mum and my dad money because I used their sheds. My mum had a tin shed by then she'd moved to a prefab. I forgot that bit. And she'd got a prefab. The caravan had gone and we'd moved up in the world and we had this prefab. And they had tin sheds with the prefab. So I used that as my factory. And in Malmesbury and in Bristol, I had a different set of people. And so I had outlets in Bristol and in Malmesbury. It was quite good. And I had 2 factories, and that was 2 lots of different people. And that was sort of worked going around selling these.